The Soviet Union built an ABM system around Moscow known as the Galosh system. And it's interesting that in the early strategic writings, they give enormous weight to the mission of ballistic missile defense. This is absolutely critical because unless you can solve that problem in a way, it's going to be very difficult to win a nuclear war. They had built earlier a very expensive air defense system around Moscow. The Soviet Union was thinking about how you would wage a nuclear war, how you would survive a nuclear war and prevail in a nuclear war.
With the revelation of the actual defense system in a May Day parade, there was great concern that defense systems of this sort were going to be built in large numbers and spread around the Soviet Union.
We assumed that they wouldn't just defend Moscow, they would extend it across all of Russia, all of the Soviet Union. And we had to think about how would we respond to that.
For McNamara, a Soviet ABM system would challenge the policy of assured destruction. Constrained by budget, McNamara's dilemma was to choose between developing new offensive systems to penetrate Galosh or to develop anti-ballistic missile defenses to guard against Soviet ICBMs.
An offensive ballistic missile has three phases of flight: the boost phase, the mid-course phase, and the terminal phase. And you can try to shoot it down in any one of those phases. Early missile defense efforts were largely in the terminal phase because it wasn't possible with the technology of the time to see the missiles in the early part of their flight, let alone to attack them.
Nike X was a revolutionary concept. Revolutionary in the radar. It was a phased array, a large perimeter acquisition early warning radar, and then two different kinds of missiles. A long-range missile, Spartan, and a short-range missile, Sprint. It actually exploded out of the silo.
They were not ever destined to be completely successful. One could think of a way to frustrate those defenses by bringing in ballistic missiles in line to the same target.
To defend cities against nuclear weapons delivered by missiles means you have to intercept high up in the atmosphere.
When you made the first intercept, you would create a fireball which would block out communications over a vast volume. The other missiles would continue to fly in their line and emerge. Your defense system would see it, it would move out to intercept it, and you would have another fireball in a blacked out region. But of course, these are now stacking closer and closer to the target.
They can ladder down in order to hide incoming warheads behind other warheads. And for those reasons, we've never been able to implement a defense of cities, and that's the real problem, to defend our values against nuclear attack.
McNamara was confronted with technical challenges to ballistic missile defense, as well as its cost-effectiveness. In 1964, a study of defenses was prepared for Harold Brown, the Director of Defense Research and Engineering.
At the then state of ballistic missile defense, it didn't make sense to mount a big ballistic missile defense program. No matter how much you do in the way of ballistic missile defense, the other side can, by spending considerably less effort, overcome what you do.
Both sides would tend to build up their offensive forces to overcome any deployed ABM system, even though those ABM systems on both sides were likely to be ineffective.
So the buyer of the defense didn't get anywhere, spent his money on a lousy defense, and all he got was to face more offense.
It was this race that went on for decades between the offense and the defense. And if you think of defense as hardening and mobility as well as anti-missiles, well, And at times one seemed to have the edge, at times others seemed to have the edge. I think McNamara reached the conclusion that the offense had the advantage.
The proper response is expansion of our offense. MIRVs that could substantially increase our offensive capability was one way of doing it.
The approach that was taken by the Navy was to develop a very small reentry vehicle, a reentry body, carrying a small nuclear warhead that could be put in large numbers on the front end of a submarine-launched missile. This was the birth of what we call Poseidon.
Multiple reentry vehicles evolved into multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. MIRVs would essentially multiply the number of nuclear warheads the U.S. could deliver in a strategic attack. By August 1968, MIRVs were successfully tested with the Air Force's Minuteman.
I initiated, or at least approved, the research development of MIRV technology. And I think I was wrong.
McNamara thought he was wrong because he was worried about an arms race between the superpowers, what he called an action-reaction phenomenon. Despite his budgetary efforts to limit the growth of nuclear weapon systems, pressure continued to mount for an anti-ballistic missile defense.
President Johnson felt that something had to be done to protect the people. The president called for the deployment of a Sentinel. Sentinel was to provide area coverage of the U.S. The arguments against it were based mainly on the recognition that the Soviet forces were so numerous that any defense deployment of the Sentinel type was likely to be overwhelmed.
The announcement to deploy Sentinel launched a new debate. Experts from outside the Pentagon weighed in on the deficiencies of ABM, underscoring that no such system could provide a leak-proof area defense of cities.
The conclusions were that mid-course intercept of ballistic missiles really doesn't work because there are too many countermeasures. That is, you can put warheads in balloons, you can have additional balloons that in the vacuum of space look like warheads, and so you're pushed to defense, terminal defense. That's fine if you're terminally defending your missile silos.
That system, even with that relatively limited mission, not trying to defend people, wasn't very effective.
Renamed Safeguard, the broad vision of an area population defense against nuclear weapons was traded for a point defense of Minuteman silos. But even in this truncated form, ABM was destined to be short-lived and would soon be overshadowed by new and competing policy initiatives.
The decade of the 1960s is a crucial one for public responses to nuclear weapons. We have a series of crises. The Berlin crisis in 1961, when Kennedy advocates a renewed, intensified program of civil defense and fallout shelter construction. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the nation seems to come very close to nuclear war. And then the Test Ban Treaty of 1963.
Finally, there has been acknowledgement that man's future rests in his own hands. An atom test ban agreement has been initialed in Moscow.
The Test Ban Treaty was perhaps simply the first step in a series of treaties and negotiations with the Soviet Union. But once the issue of atmospheric testing was dealt with by the 1963 treaty, then deterrence theory and the whole strategy that flowed from deterrence theory, I think did have a reassuring effect, at least at some level. But nuclear strategy and public responses to nuclear issues were not unfolding in a vacuum. By '67, the Vietnam War was very much underway. And public attention and activist energies were increasingly focusing on Vietnam. And when people thought of McNamara, they didn't think of nuclear strategic innovations, they thought of Vietnam.
In 1967, McNamara and Johnson were confronting the failure of their strategy of graduated response in Vietnam on a daily basis. At the same time, McNamara was struggling to navigate competing interests among the Joint Chiefs. General Earl Wheeler, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued for increased tactical support in Vietnam, while Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay pressed for the continued growth of U.S. strategic nuclear forces.
McNamara thought that there was sort of no end to the appetite for more nuclear weapons. He wanted to basically say, I can cap the problem. We have enough stuff, we got all kinds of capability here. We can assure that we can destroy them no matter what they do to us. We can ride out a first strike, and in our retaliatory capability, we can destroy everything of value to them. That's enough.
For McNamara and the arms control community, mutual assured destruction became almost a catechism. It was a way to reduce the incentive for a first strike on either side, while ensuring a stable U.S. nuclear force posture for deterrence.
Let's make each side the hostage of the other, so neither side has to build up its defenses, neither side has to truly worry about a first strike because its retaliatory forces will be sufficient to wipe out the other side.
So I think that assured destruction as a device for putting a lid on the arms race was totally compatible with arms control. They kind of went hand in hand.
Historic Holly Bush in Glassboro, New Jersey, where East meets West. President Johnson, with aides Rusk and McNamara, awaits his first of two summit talks with Soviet Premier Kosygin. Kosygin arrival marks the first in-person meeting of the two world leaders.
Mutual assured destruction became the foundation of an initial effort to engage the Soviets in strategic talks. While the meeting yielded no agreement, Glassboro was the beginning of a period of détente. In January 1969, détente would become the centerpiece of the Nixon administration. The new president and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, sought to reduce Cold War tensions by increased diplomatic, commercial, and cultural contacts with the Soviets, and especially through strategic arms control.
Nixon and Kissinger were very concerned that we needed negotiated arms control, not just for sort of a peaceful world, but to use it as a diplomatic tool to slow down the growth of Soviet systems, because we were not going to match them.
Therefore, it's very important to maintain stability. And how do you maintain stability? You maintain stability by trying to have a workable relationship with the other side. And that's what détente was.
Within 3 years, arms control negotiators in Geneva hammered out an anti-ballistic missile treaty that significantly limited defensive systems. The talks also yielded SALT I, otherwise known as the Interim Agreement, temporarily capping the numbers of offensive missile launchers.
The ABM Treaty was designed to enshrine, to institutionalize, as it were, mutual assured destruction.
But it included one additional element. It included an estimate of technology that both sides basically had concluded that at that time, deployment of ABM systems was not going to be militarily effective.
I think détente was an attempt to both calm things down and also to allow, strangely enough, to allow us to keep on building systems.
The interim agreement was largely thrown together by Nixon and Kissinger at the summit. It was intended to be a cap on the ICBM and SLBM forces of the two sides at the level at which they then were.
Once we had an arms control treaty which limited missile carriers rather than warheads, then it was inevitable that we moved towards MIRVs, and did.
We moved forward with arms control and détente on the one hand, while on the other hand, going right ahead with MIRVed missiles and going through several generations of MIRVed missiles.
Then the side that deployed MIRVs would gain a huge advantage over the side that did not have them. And so both sides ended up deploying them. And we went very, very short amount of time from 1,000 warheads to 10,000 warheads, primarily as a direct consequence of the SALT Treaty.
Prior to SALT I, you had basically an unrestrained arms race. After SALT I, the arms race just went into another channel, that of missile growth and MIRVs and improved accuracy and that sort of thing.
The search for a new Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement began in 1974 as both sides quietly continued to modernize their nuclear forces.
We were determined that in drafting the American version of what would be the SALT II treaty, that we would try to correct some of these things.
The concept of assured destruction and the fact of détente did lull people into feeling that the nuclear arms race wasn't that dangerous and there wasn't really any need to pay much attention to it.
If the threat of war with Russia is diminished, that means the threat of atomic destruction, global thermonuclear war, is diminished as well. So détente is crucial to understanding America's nuclear history in the 70s.
Yes. Both you and Secretary Laird have stressed the need for superiority over the Soviet Union. How do you distinguish between the validity of that stance and the argument of Dr. Kissinger for what he calls sufficiency?
Here again, I think the semantics may offer an inappropriate approach to the problem. Our objective is to be sure that the United States has sufficient military power to defend our interest. I think sufficiency is a better term, actually, than either superiority or parity.
When they announced the policy of strategic sufficiency in January 1969, Nixon and Kissinger appeared to accept that nuclear parity with the Soviets was a fact of life. Immediately following the announcement, Kissinger launched several interagency studies evaluating U.S. military posture and the balance of power. The objective was to develop alternative military strategies.
I mean, I think that Kissinger was in the camp that was skeptical of assured destruction, because assured destruction creates the impression of a kind of static situation. In other words, once I have enough, I don't have to think about it anymore. But this is an evolving situation. It's dynamic.
The defects of mutual assured destruction were quite clear even beforehand. The studies that we did at RAND emphasized that the capacity for extended deterrence was diminishing simply because we would be self-deterred if we continued to talk about a massive PSYOP-like strike at the Soviet Union.
There was a real question over whether, as de Gaulle put it, the U.S. would risk destruction of Washington or New York in order to save Paris or Berlin.
In response to this question, Schlesinger argued that traditional answers are no longer satisfactory, and he recommended exploring the sub-PSYOP class of options.
So the notion was one would use nuclear weapons to strike in a limited area. That would convey to the Soviets that indeed we were serious and we were ready to respond.
Schlesinger, as an analyst at the RAND Corporation, was much more of the view that nuclear weapons had to be finely calibrated. He was very highly differentiated in his views of nuclear weapons.
Meanwhile, at the National Security Council, Kissinger recommended additional study for the kinds of situations which the president might actually face in a crisis. Specifically, it should examine more discriminating options than the present PSYOP.
When we were consulting with Henry Kissinger in 1969, we argued that they ought to have a presidential reserve force, which would be these limited options.
The top leadership, everybody, including Schlesinger, always thought in terms of limited options and always had a struggle with that because the planning and the hardware were set primarily by the big options.
I think there was a desire from the earliest PSYOPs to have smaller options, and so there were, quote, smaller options, but they contained many hundreds of weapons, and so they were not small at all. And so the structure of the PSYOP itself was such that you had small options, but they were embedded within larger options, embedded within larger options.
And so at multiple hundreds of weapons in the small options, there was every chance of bringing a massive response. If you're the Russians and a small option were executed, you had a strike by ICBMs, and then 5 hours later you had the SLBMs, and then 18 hours later the bombers came roaring, and it looked like 3 separate attacks.
For us, it might seem very, very specific, very carefully calibrated. For them, it might look like we were going to take out the entire society.
Fears about a diminished U.S. capacity for extended deterrence would soon be addressed by improvements in the accuracy of Minuteman.
We had been pressing for more accurate weapons so that we could be assured that we could pluck out this target or that target without a major impact on the surrounding life, what was generally referred to as collateral damage.
Technologists love this because the idea now was to make weapons that were more accurate, faster to fire.
I think the technologists have driven a lot of this stuff. I mean, we could make this kind of a ballistic missile, therefore we did. Therefore the policy people said, gosh, this would fit in very well with how we're thinking.
But the improvements of accuracy were a normal consequence of the technology and of the military views about what's valuable. And they didn't derive from any great strategic thinking. Many other people read the improvements in accuracy in a different way.
I remember the day in June of 1970 when the United States announced that it was going to go ahead with MIRVs. We came to a fork in the road where we could go with assured destruction and arms control and limits, or we were going to push forward with nuclear warfighting.
The MIRV technology initiated by McNamara had come to fruition, providing target planners with a significant increase in the number of available warheads. The rapidly retargetable and highly accurate MIRVed Minuteman III also contributed to a revival of counterforce in strategic thinking.
I think a combination of the increase in numbers and the change in the quality being ever better for attacking military targets, and that was kind of sinking through that it wasn't just assured destruction.
On January 10, 1974, the now Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger, introduced the policy underlying National Security Decision Memorandum 242, or NISDM 242. The new policy was quickly dubbed the Schlesinger Doctrine.
The selective strikes that I emphasized were intended to convey to the Soviet leadership that the United States would not be self-deterred, that we were prepared to initiate the use of nuclear weapons against Soviet territory, and that they should have that firmly in mind in making their plans.
We had, for the first time, an open statement by a U.S. Secretary of Defense that the United States did not merely have a mutual assured destruction policy, but actually wanted to have and did have and was trying to acquire and improve warfighting capabilities.
The warfighting capability, it was not intended to fight a war, it was intended to strengthen deterrence.
Within a month of Schlesinger's public announcement, NISDM 242 prompted 4 major actions to increase the options available to the president. The new declaratory policy also briefly renewed public fears of thermonuclear war. But concerns about a shift toward a posture of nuclear war fighting were overshadowed by the administration's continued progress in arms control and the promise of détente.
Some people had always thought that this was like the priesthood just debating among themselves. It really had no operational significance. Others said, no, you're not right, that this will have an effect on thinking in key elements of the civilian and military leadership, and it will make the use of nuclear weapons more likely.
Making war more likely. That was not our view. We thought that it would make war less likely. If one wants to preserve the peace, as I think President Washington said, plan for war.
For many, the signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Interim Agreement in 1972 came to symbolize the essential stillness of the Cold War, where each nuclear adversary sought to limit the strategic arsenal of the other. U.S. efforts at arms control, together with changes in strategic nuclear policy, were based on the idea that the Soviets shared U.S. beliefs about deterrence and about fighting a nuclear war if deterrence should fail.
I think there was a view which was very widespread and pervasive that the Soviet Union must think about nuclear war in the same way as the United States.
In the mid-70s, the United States had fallen into a trap intellectually. We had fallen into a trap of thinking about what would deter us. And we mirror image that onto the Russians.
It's important to recognize that that it's what the other side thinks that deters the other side, not what you think.
Right after the Moscow summit in 1972, the number of tests of Soviet missiles just expanded exponentially. And they began to introduce MIRV capability and more accurate guidance.
The fear was that they could put large numbers of warheads on those same missiles, and that then they could effectively threaten our land-based deterrent.
So you began to get real worries, not only about the capabilities of the new systems, but about the thinking that lay behind these deployments. What were they really thinking?
President Gerald Ford and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger thought they knew what the Soviets were thinking when they met with Leonid Brezhnev and his advisors in November 1974. Gerald Ford continued to invest heavily in strategic arms control, and the SALT talks continued apace during his short-lived administration.
We're going to have a great government, a great nation, and it's because of you, not me.
In the months following the upset victory of Jimmy Carter as president, progress on arms control slowed as the mood in Washington shifted away from détente and toward defense. In early 1977, Paul Nitze, the consummate Cold Warrior who had written NSC 68, now led the Committee on the Present Danger. The committee posed frightening hypothetical scenarios that would leave a U.S. president self-deterred in the face of a Soviet counterforce attack.
You then get the argument developing about a window of vulnerability in which a Soviet first strike could destroy the U.S. ICBM force.
The committee argued that the remaining U.S. nuclear forces, the bombers and the ballistic missile submarines, would not be effective in counterforce operations.
So that sort of forced the U.S. back to an assured destruction attack, primarily against cities.
U.S. retaliation with SLBMs would be deterred by the fact that the Soviet Union could then retaliate against American cities.
There would be strong pressures for us to halt the conflict before either side launched their final forces, and in which case we would have lost because most of our nuclear force would be destroyed.
such an approach, which left things unequal, worried some people.
The mood in Washington recalled earlier periods of increasing vulnerability, the first Soviet atomic test, the launch of Sputnik, and the worries of a missile gap that followed. The U.S. watched as the Soviets exploited local conflicts in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, and as they expanded their political and economic influence. Then, in October 1977, the Soviets alarmed the Europeans with the deployment of the highly accurate SS-20, a MIRVed IRBM aimed at NATO military targets. West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt publicly declared that the Soviet SS-20s represented a major new threat to NATO, which demanded a response. Others, like the Committee on the Present Danger, asserted that the deployment of SS-20s created a broader imbalance in theater or tactical nuclear forces.
The Soviets saw the future military balance as something they were tilting in their own favor.
There was a famous article by Richard Pipes called Why the Soviet Union Thinks It Can Fight and Win a Nuclear War, in which he argued, they didn't accept the theory of deterrence. In the last analysis, when you're in the depths of a crisis, what really would deter them? And some people would say the only thing that would deter them is the knowledge that they would be defeated.
Much more important was growing evidence that they had built very heavily protected, deep underground shelters in the Moscow area. And it did become clear that at least the leadership was planning seriously to survive a nuclear war.
Jimmy Carter entered office championing arms control and challenging the Joint Chiefs to consider a minimum deterrent nuclear force consisting of fleet ballistic missile submarines.
He had been an officer on a nuclear submarine. One of the first questions he asked during the first presidential briefing on nuclear plans, why don't we just have a survivable force of 200 missiles? I think may have been the beginning of the end of his credibility with the military.
Within his first year in office, the president confronted an increasingly aggressive Soviet adversary. Now, in the face of new and worrisome intelligence estimates, Carter issued Presidential Directive 18 that launched a review of U.S. targeting policy. Leon Sloss, who had a long tenure with the State Department, led a seminal study called the Nuclear Targeting Policy Review.
I think a critical driver was a reassessment of Soviet strategic objectives. And then we also assessed how they were building and deploying their forces. They believed that they could survive a nuclear war, they could control a nuclear war.
What Sloss's study came out and said was, you're dealing with people who look at nuclear war differently. They build deep bunkers, they plan for reloads and refirings of ICBMs. These guys have a different view, and what you need to do if you're going to have an effective deterrent is get into the mind of the Soviet leadership, figure out what they value, and hold it at risk.
Obviously, their own lives were important. Their control over the various constituents of the Soviet Union and their own political control. Therefore, the countervailing strategy concentrated on those targets.
The countervailing strategy. I woke up one morning and said for the posture statement, we needed something a little bit different to help Secretary Brown and get him some publicity. And I said, why don't we call it countervailing instead of counterforce or something? And so I can't even remember whether I discussed it with Harold or whether I just put it in the posture statement. But it went over. Not a thing changed.
PD-59, however, had an important breakthrough. It was an attempt to look at deterrence through Soviet eyes. And that became the basis for the notion of having many options, of having them nested.
I was discouraged to discover that there was a notion that we might attack the Soviet political leadership. And if we did so, all possibilities of restraint would be destroyed at that time.
On the other hand, if leadership on the other side is convinced that, well, things may go badly, but we'll survive in the end, that's not as much of a deterrent as the thought that if things go badly and if we can't reach a settlement before almost everybody before tens of millions of people get killed, you're not going to be able to survive personally.
This is the Harold Brown, we're not going to win a nuclear war. We know that. We need to make sure the Soviet leaders understand the same thing.
In an era of strategic nuclear equivalence, the U.S. sought to deny the Soviets any possibility of victory by remaining capable of fighting successfully. PD-59 signaled a decisive shift away from the policy of mutual assured destruction toward a posture of nuclear war fighting.
But I think it was very clear in Harold Brown's mind that the purpose of this was to influence the Soviet decision maker, not to fight a nuclear war.
I never read PD-59 to say we expected to win. We read PD-59 as saying that we were to terminate hostilities on circumstances favorable to the United States. That's quite different from winning.
In 1975, a snapshot would reveal two superpowers armed to the teeth, with the Soviet Union having more momentum than the U.S.
The nuclear buildup that began in the mid-70s was in response to the perception that the Soviet Union was pulling ahead of the United States. And we saw our comparative advantage being in technology, so we were always pushing our technological imperative.
In an age of sophisticated technology, the computer plays an increasingly large part in DNA's programming. Computer-generated codes describe the nuclear blast and thermal environment and predict the effects on weapon systems.
The neutron bomb was something that was actually first developed for the Sentinel system. And this was a warhead which would kill by strong flux of 14 million volt neutrons. But once one realized that the kill was produced by neutrons, people began to think about the possibility of killing people and not equipment or not facilities.
Particularly in relation to the hypothetical use selectively in Western Europe.
Tests were aimed at defining and solving the problems of tactical nuclear warfare. Could troops and vehicles move through the terrain in the wake of a tactical weapons blast?
The problem there was how do you defeat mass tank invasions without destroying all the villages, which are about a mile or so apart throughout Central Europe. If you do it with neutrons, the idea was you can go to much lower yield and leave the villages and their inhabitants unscathed, relatively speaking. None of this would be very clean, and still get at the tank crews.
It's making nuclear weapons seem less threatening if they come to seem more like conventional weapons and actually can be used in theater operations rather than just to destroy cities.
In June 1977, the Carter administration's defense budget included the production of enhanced radiation nuclear warheads. The so-called neutron bomb was to be deployed on NATO bases and was described as the first in a new generation of tactical mini-nukes. By early 1978, Jimmy Carter found himself at the center of a heated debate that played out in the streets of Western Europe and at NATO headquarters. Protesters alleged that the neutron bomb would kill people, leaving property intact. At the same time, NATO defense ministers feared being decoupled from the U.S. strategic deterrent, leaving Europe to become a nuclear battlefield. Under intense public pressure, Carter suspended production and deployment of neutron weapons.
The neutron bomb, in terms of public opinion, was definitely a non-starter, and it contributed to what was a new wave of anti-nuclear activism.
Brussels, December 1979, an unusual joint meeting of NATO defense and foreign ministers.
On December 12, 1979, NATO agreed to modernize its nuclear forces, going forward with plans to deploy new intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
The fear was that the Soviets could strike Western Europe from their homeland, and we had no comparable system. And so NATO embarked on the so-called two-track strategy. It would modernize to have a comparable capability by deploying ground-launched cruise missiles in 5 countries and by deploying a modified Pershing II missile in Germany. And it would seek to eliminate the SS-20s through negotiations.
But no sooner had the two-track decision been made, the Soviets then invaded Afghanistan.
It began on Christmas Eve with 350 transport planes shuttling a Soviet airborne division into Kabul airport. 3 days later, the main invasion force followed. 50,000 troops crossed the Soviet-Afghan border. The Kremlin had committed its forces to a long and costly occupation.
Neither the United States nor any other nation which is committed to world peace and stability can continue to do business as usual with the Soviet Union.
The invasion led to a suspension of talks with the Soviets on intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe, and it forced Jimmy Carter to withdraw SALT II from consideration by the U.S. Senate. The treaty had been the centerpiece of Carter's efforts to reinvigorate détente. Its withdrawal dealt a sharp blow to the president.
And I think Carter just saw that it was hopeless, and rather than suffer a defeat which I think he felt would be harmful to arms control itself, he withdrew the treaty.
Without a strategic arms limitation agreement, Carter was left with the largest peacetime military buildup in history, which he had initiated with the 1980 defense budget. For many Americans, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan marked the end of détente and the beginning of a second Cold War, with a new and more virulent nuclear arms race.
I had this image in my mind of successive generations of increasingly sophisticated warfighting systems. We were not rejecting nuclear deterrence. We were not necessarily rejecting mutual assured destruction. We were only rejecting the tightening of a tripwire that was actually being created to make nuclear war more likely deliberately.
With the proposal by Forsberg of a nuclear freeze it in place, had the wonderful appeal of simplicity. It was easy to grasp.
It was such a moderate appeal for a radical campaign, and it was contrasted with this radical rhetoric of the president.
How do you do? Sam?
Mr. President, what do you see as the long-range intentions of the Soviet Union?
I don't have to think of an answer as to what I think their intentions are. They have repeated it, that the only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral.
When his administration came in, the Reagan people said, no, this is an evil empire. The only way you can deal with it is through strength.
Initially, the response of the Reagan administration was to be suspicious of arms control, to not have an interest in it.
And the argument was, we are inferior to the Soviets in nuclear weapons. We cannot negotiate from a position of inferiority.
Ronald Reagan led a neoconservative contingent into office in 1981. Like himself, many of his advisors were former members of the Committee on the Present Danger, and they continued to believe that the U.S. remained strategically vulnerable. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger moved quickly to establish a program of strategic modernization, adding $33 billion to Jimmy Carter's record defense budget.
Part of the Reagan campaign was to convince the Congress, who had to appropriate the money.
Soviet military power used colorful prose, and it used the worst possible case, indeed stretching some points about what the Soviet Union was doing. Nothing was underestimated.
I am announcing today a plan to revitalize our strategic forces and maintain America's ability to keep the peace well into the next century. First, I have directed the Secretary of Defense to revitalize our bomber forces by constructing and deploying some 100 B-1 bombers. Second, I have ordered the strengthening and expansion of our sea-based forces. Third, I've ordered completion of the MX missiles.
Ronald Reagan had made the MX missile the centerpiece of the largest military buildup in U.S. history. Meanwhile, massive anti-nuclear demonstrations were occurring throughout Western Europe in protest of NATO's plans to deploy new intermediate-range U.S. missiles.
Public protests in Europe had a tremendous effect in pushing the United States forward to pursue an INF agreement.
The United States is prepared to cancel its deployment of Pershing II and ground-launched missiles if the Soviets will dismantle their SS-20, SS-4, and SS-5 missiles. This would be an historic step.
The proposal, known as Zero Option, was praised in some quarters as bold and politically brilliant, but others saw it as disingenuous. The administration was asking the Soviets to dismantle hundreds of new weapons in return for a U.S. agreement not to deploy a missile force that had not yet been built.
The American and Russian ambassadors have decided that they'll meet alternately at each other's mission, initially twice a week.
The INF talks began in late 1981, but made little progress.
Until the arms race ends, until we have real peace with real justice, we will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
By the spring of 1982, the nuclear freeze movement was spreading across the United States and culminated with a rally in New York's Central Park that many would call the biggest protest in American history.
To understand what took place under Reagan, I think you have to understand that by that time there were very, very strong forces at work within the government. President Reagan hated nuclear weapons. President Reagan would like to have been the president that went down in history as getting rid of nuclear weapons. The Secretary of Defense hated any kind of concession to the Soviets. The Secretary of Defense thought we needed more nuclear weapons.
The Reagan administration, I think, was dissatisfied with the thought that the U.S. might not win a thermonuclear war.
There was certainly a rhetorical change in that Reagan and Secretary Weinberger talked about prevailing.
From the beginning, the hallmark of the Reagan administration was peace through strength. Even as calls for a nuclear freeze grew louder in the fall of 1981, Ronald Reagan directed changes in top-secret guidance for the use of nuclear weapons. National Security Decision Directive 13 stated that we must be prepared to wage war successfully, and that the United States and its allies must prevail.
NSDD 13 was not that different from PD 59, but we didn't want to be justifying the largest buildup in history based on Jimmy Carter's strategic policy.
There is not that much difference. It alters the priority of the targets. The other thing about NSDD-13 is that it had some unfortunate rhetoric. It had this very chest-thumping, if there's a nuclear war, we're going to prevail.
Even though these were very classified documents and nobody ever intended them to see the light of the day, there was nonetheless great attention paid to the rhetoric by which you expressed things, because it became the basis for how you talked about nuclear weapons in public discourse.
In the spring of 1982, the Reagan administration's increasingly harsh public rhetoric about the Soviet Union served to fuel public fears.
The image of Russian militarization and the Russian military and the possibility of war between the two sides, it just seemed like there was a kind of warmongering administration.
The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
As Reagan was denouncing the Soviets, the Pentagon's defense guidance was leaked to the New York Times. The combination of harsh public rhetoric and secret guidance about the possibility of a protracted nuclear war, in which American nuclear forces must prevail, made for a combustible mixture.
We worked very hard to get declaratory policy down right. That was the year of the nuclear freeze, the nuclear protest, and we had to explain what we were doing to our own people. Nobody knew what prevailing meant. And when it finally became an issue in the context of the nuclear freeze, President Reagan began using a phrase that we worked out with Secretary Weinberger. You know, a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought.
While the Reagan administration softened the language of declaratory policy, a war of words and images continued between a president who sought to confront the Soviet Union.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
And those seeking to portray the fearsome result of that confrontation.
The danger was described in very vivid, very emotional terms, and even if significant portions of the human population survived the initial cataclysm of war, the long-term ecological effects would be absolutely devastating.
The nuclear winter thesis as advanced by Sagan was basically wrong. The effect was vastly overblown, and the model which they used was clearly wrong.
It wasn't so much that people thought that there wouldn't be a nuclear winter, but that he really overstated it pretty seriously.
So once you put in realistic assumptions about targeting and realistic assumptions about what the climate would do, you came up with a potential cooling of possibly a summer's duration, a few months, over certain parts of the world. Not a trivial effect, but nothing like what was originally described.
I think that the nuclear winter debate intensified the images that people had about what a nuclear war would do to the world and why a nuclear warfighting policy didn't make any sense.
Reagan was facing a problem. He did not trust that the Soviets would pursue a peaceful cause. He felt strongly he had to ensure the survival of the American people under favorable conditions.
Edward Teller had long advised Ronald Reagan on matters of defense and now urged the president to abandon mutual assured destruction for a doctrine of assured survival. In the fall of 1982, Teller pressed Reagan to mount a breakthrough effort for a nuclear strategic defense. Reagan was receptive to Teller as well as to other proponents of non-nuclear defenses at the High Frontier Group. Reagan was searching for a way to challenge the Soviets that did not rely upon offensive weapons or arms control.
And technology was a very good way of challenging them because this was our strong suit. All of this came together and Reagan, without very many people knowing, he announced what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Well, the origin of SDI was President Reagan's antipathy to nuclear weapons. And he wanted a defense, a non-nuclear defense against nuclear weapons, which somehow he argued would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
A shield, laser-based technologies, exciting new technologies that can render us safe from any possible nuclear attack, and he painted a very compelling image of the power of American technological know-how.
The supporters of the SDI in the technical community, and there weren't actually that many of them, but they believed, and rightly, that technology had changed substantially and that it was worth taking another look. Maybe we could build brighter lasers, higher intensity lasers, maybe X-ray lasers pumped with nuclear weapons and so forth.
That was fine on paper. There was not ever, to my knowledge, a laser system that could be deployed that made any sense whatever. Lasers in space would have been extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily vulnerable and not assured of performance.
We really never had a defense. We had a policy to build a system, but that was only to do the research and development, $25 billion within the first 5 years, $50 billion, $75 billion over a period of 10 years, and then we would decide whether to go ahead with the construction.
So suddenly, almost overnight, people aren't debating nuclear arms control or nuclear freeze proposals. They're debating the technological effectiveness of the Strategic Defense Initiative.
And I think for a brief while, there was some significant hope among the population at large. But I believe that that was pretty quickly put to rest by the sort of traditional arms control community argument that was made right away and repeatedly, and I think very effectively, that there simply wasn't any way to have a comprehensive defense.
We had some nice technology from SDI, but no way you could have the leak-tight system.
The initial euphoria over SDI subsided in the months following the president's speech. Reagan's initiative would evolve into an extensive research and development effort, and the theme of U.S. technological superiority would clearly resonate with the Soviets. Reagan believed he had offered a way out, a technological solution to the nearly 40-year-old dilemma surrounding nuclear weapons. In May 1983, a pastoral letter by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops reframed this dilemma in moral terms, casting doubt upon the very premise of nuclear deterrence, not as an end in itself, but as a step on the way toward a progressive disarmament. But events in late 1983 would push the goal of arms control virtually out of reach. The September shoot-down of a Korean passenger jet by Soviet defenses was followed in November by the delivery of intermediate-range nuclear missiles to NATO, prompting the Soviets to withdraw from arms control negotiations altogether.
U.S.-Soviet relations were probably at that moment at the lowest point in many years. It was a true nadir.
This is San Francisco. We have lost New York signal. Radar sources confirm the explosion of nuclear devices there in New York and up and down the East Coast.
We interrupt this program at the request of the White House.
At the end of 1983, the threat played out on television in dramatizations that, for many, crystallized the fear of sudden and catastrophic nuclear war.
They're on their way to Russia.
The nuclear danger was encapsulated with the image of global thermonuclear war. All of this popular culture material feeds into shaping a public mood that in turn creates the framework within which the strategists and the diplomats and the political leaders must operate.
And it was within this complex framework of emotional, moral, and international security issues that the president now found himself. It was a very uncertain time.